The desert has a strange way of choosing its victims. It doesn't rush, it doesn't roar, and it doesn't warn. It simply waits silent, patient, and merciless until the moment a confident human being steps into its kingdom believing he can outrun it. Mauro Prosperi had trained for years, had pushed his body to its limits, had crossed mountains and cities and endless roads, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the moment the Sahara finally decided to swallow him whole. The Marathon des Sables had always been described as the toughest foot race on Earth, 6 brutal stages across the Sahara, blistering heat, violent winds, and a psychological strain designed to unmake even the strongest athletes. And yet, on the morning of the race, Mauro felt invincible. Thousands of runners lined up under the rising sun, their silhouettes long on the glowing sand. Mauro adjusted his pack, inhaled the thin desert air, and told himself that pain was temporary glory, however might last forever. When the starting gun exploded, the horizon rippled with countless feet pounding the sand. Mauro ran smoothly at first, savoring the rhythm, counting his breaths, scanning the dunes ahead. The temperature climbed mercilessly, but it was nothing unexpected. Nothing alarming, nothing he couldn't dominate, until the sky changed. It started subtle, a thin, dirty smudge on the horizon. Then the wind picked up gravity, dragging an entire wall of sand behind it. The air became a violent whisper. Runners looked at one another, some slowing down, others speeding up, trying to outrun the approaching storm. Mauro tightened his headgear, pulled the cloth over his face, and kept moving. But the desert had already chosen him. Within minutes the world vanished. The sun disappeared behind a turning curtain of orange. His visibility dropped to half a meter. Sand hit him like needles. The wind howled in a deep, guttural way like something alive. Mauro dropped to one knee, covered his head, and waited for the worst to pass. Yet the storm did not pass. It grew. It became a moving prison, shuffling the dunes, erasing the race markers, stealing every sense of direction. When it finally weakened enough for him to stand, the world around him had been completely rewritten. The other runners were gone. The checkpoint flags were gone. The path was gone. Only sand remained, sand and silence. Still, Mauro didn't panic, not yet. He did what every trained runner would do. He picked a direction he believed was correct and walked. The heat pressed harder now, the sun biting into his skin like a furnace. He checked his watch. He checked his compass. He checked the horizon. None of it made sense anymore. He walked and walked, eyes burning, mouth drying, and the terrible truth slowly sharpened in his chest. He wasn't heading toward the next checkpoint. He wasn't heading toward anyone. He was heading deeper into the belly of the Sahara. Hours passed, and he felt the weight of his water supply shrinking. The organizers had promised water at the next station, a promise Mauro clung to desperately. He rationed every sip, counting them in his head. But the checkpoint never appeared. The dunes mocked him, rolling infinitely in every direction. The wind erased his footprints behind him, as if the desert itself refused to acknowledge his existence. When his water pouch finally flattened empty, silent Mauro's throat tightened with a fear he had never felt in his life. Not fear of dying. Fear of dying alone, disappearing without a trace, becoming one more grain of sand lost in this endless expanse. His lips cracked, his tongue swelled, his eyes drifted in and out of focus, and then finally he heard something, a faint, distant hum, like salvation. An airplane. His heart slammed into his ribs. He dropped his pack, scrambled inside it, and pulled out the bright red signal flare the organizers had provided. A cheap thing, a formality. A last resort tool he hoped he'd never need until now. He aimed at the sky, pulled the trigger, and fired. A thin, weak streak of red hissed upward. Pathetic, small, insignificant in the blinding daylight. The flare coughed, sputtered, and fizzled out far below the plane's altitude. Mauro screamed raspy, broken, but the wind carried his voice nowhere. The aircraft flew on, perfectly indifferent, perfectly unaware of the man dying beneath it. That was when the first real panic hit him. He staggered forward, desperate, dragging his feet, every step heavier than the last. His vision blurred, shapes melted. The sand beneath his boots felt alive, shifting and grabbing at him, and just as he felt himself beginning to fall, he saw it. A dark structure in the distance, low, rectangular, unnatural, a building. He blinked hard. It didn't vanish. Summoning the last of his strength, He stumbled toward it, pushing against the burning air, collapsing twice before finally reaching the entrance. He touched the stone cooler than the air outside and stepped in, a shelter, an old tomb, a forgotten desert burial site. He dropped to his knees, trembling. For a moment he felt saved, but salvation can be a cruel illusion. Inside the tomb, the air was thick, stale, and almost completely dark. Mauro lay on the ground, trying to slow his breathing, trying to convince himself he was safe. But the silence pressed into him, whispering a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. No one was coming. No one knew where he was. No one had even seen his flare. He tried to sleep, but every second brought new waves of panic. His heart raced uncontrollably, his mouth was bleeding from dryness. His thoughts warped, looping in circles until one idea, cold, sharp, poisonous, took over everything else. Maybe it was better to end it before the desert did. He stared into the darkness for a long time. Then he reached into his pack. His fingers shook as they found the blade. He laid it on the sandy floor, its metal catching a sliver of dying light. He sat down beside it. He lifted his wrist. And for the first time since the race began, Mauro Prosperi accepted the possibility of death. He closed his eyes, took a slow, broken breath, and whispered a final apology to his family. The tomb around him seemed to pulse, like a living creature waiting for its next meal. He pressed the blade against his skin, and then a sound, soft, rapid, fluttering, a bat, another, then another. They rustled in the ceiling, squeaking, circling, disturbed by his movement. Mauro opened his eyes, confused, the blade still cold against his wrist. And in that strange moment, delirious, dehydrated, half-conscious, he thought, if there are bats, there must be water somewhere. The blade dropped from his fingers. The thought of death dissolved, replaced by something raw and primal, survival. He looked at the creatures clinging to the stone above him, the only living things he had seen in days, and he realized that he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance, no matter how small. The tomb felt colder as the hours passed, but Mauro's body burned with fever and dehydration. The bats still clung to the ceiling like trembling shadows, their tiny movements echoing through the stone chamber. He stared at them, blinking slowly, his mind drifting between delusion and survival instinct. The presence of living creatures meant one thing above all else: there had to be moisture somewhere. Life simply didn't exist without it. With shaking hands, he pushed himself up and explored the walls in the darkness. His fingers traced rough stone, ancient carvings, and patches of cool, damp air. He leaned closer, inhaling deeply, desperate for any hint of moisture. The smell was faint, but unmistakable: earth, decay, and something organic. It was enough to ignite the spark inside him again. Hours passed in a haze, his vision warped, his legs trembled, his thoughts tangled. He laid it on the sandy floor, its metal catching a sliver of dying light. He sat down beside it. He lifted his wrist. And for the first time since the race began, Mauro Prosperi accepted the possibility of death. He closed his eyes, took a slow, broken breath, and whispered a final apology to his family. The tomb around him seemed to pulse, like a living creature waiting for its next meal. He pressed the blade against his skin, and then a sound, soft, rapid, fluttering, a bat, another, then another. They rustled in the ceiling, squeaking, circling, disturbed by his movement. Mauro opened his eyes, confused, the blade still cold against his wrist. And in that strange moment, delirious, dehydrated, half-conscious, he thought, if there are bats, there must be water somewhere. The blade dropped from his fingers. The thought of death dissolved, replaced by something raw and primal: survival. He looked at the creatures clinging to the stone above him, the only living things he had seen in days, and he realized that he wasn't done fighting. Not yet, not while there was still a chance, no matter how small. The tomb felt colder as the hours passed, but Mauro's body burned with fever and dehydration. The bats still clung to the ceiling like trembling shadows, their tiny movements echoing through the stone chamber. He stared at them, blinking slowly, his mind drifting between delusion and survival instinct. The presence of living creatures meant one thing above all else: there had to be moisture somewhere. Life simply didn't exist without it. With shaking hands, he pushed himself up and explored the walls in the darkness. His fingers traced rough stone, ancient carvings, and patches of cool, damp air. He leaned closer, inhaling deeply, desperate for any hint of moisture. The smell was faint but unmistakable: earth, decay, and something organic. It was enough to ignite the spark inside him again. Hours passed in a haze, his vision warped, his legs trembled, his thoughts tangled like knots. Hunger gnawed at him, an animal clawing from inside his stomach. He had never imagined hunger could feel like pain, sharp, rhythmic, primitive. The bat stirred above him again. One lost its grip and fluttered downward, landing weakly near Mauro's feet. It twitched. He stared at it, breath shallow, mind fighting with itself. He didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to think about what his body was forcing him to consider. But the laws of the desert had already rewritten his morality. He whispered an apology before doing what he must. What followed wasn't a meal. It was an act of survival performed by a fading man whose body demanded fuel. The act itself was small, desperate, and silent, but it kept him alive. It kept his brain firing, his blood moving, his consciousness tethered to life by the thinnest possible string. He survived the night. When dawn broke, Mauro crawled to the entrance of the tomb. The sun stabbed into his eyes, but the light felt reassuring. It meant time had passed and he was still breathing. He sat there for a long moment, fighting dizziness. His tongue felt like leather. His lips were cracked and bleeding, but the desert wasn't done with him. Not yet. Hours later, he heard something again, the distant thumping of helicopter blades. Not an illusion, not a hallucination, real movement in the sky. He stumbled out of the tomb, falling into the sand. The helicopter hovered far above, small but visible. His heart hammered painfully. This was his moment, his only chance. He needed to create smoke thick, black, unmistakable. He crawled back into the shelter, dragging every item he had. Clothes, sleeping bag, papers, scraps of fabric, anything that could burn. His hands trembled violently as he piled them outside the entrance. Every ounce of energy he had left went into this single, desperate task. He struck his flint. Sparks. Again, nothing. Then finally a flicker. A thin, weak flame. He fed it with shaking hands, blowing, whispering, begging. The fire caught the scraps, then the fabric, then the rest. Smoke rose dark, thick, hopeful. It twisted upward, reaching toward the sky like a final scream for help. But the helicopter didn't change course. It didn't slow down. It didn't see him. The smoke that meant everything to Mauro meant nothing to the vast sky above. He watched it disappear, his hope shrinking with it. The fire crackled beside him, consuming the last of his belongings. His tools, his spare clothes, his comfort, his identity, all of it rising as smoke and disappearing into indifferent air. He had nothing left, nothing except movement. He stood up barely and staggered into the desert again. Step after step, breath after breath, as if the land itself were dragging him forward. Hours blurred into a single, endless moment. His mind floated somewhere between dream and nightmare. He wasn't sure if he was walking, drifting, or being carried by pure will. Then he saw it, a shimmer, a glint, something impossible. At first he thought it was another mirage, a trick the desert loved to play, but as he drew closer the shape sharpened, a rock formation, a narrow crevice, and inside it a tiny pool of water, shallow but real, tucked away from the sun. He dropped to his knees so fast he didn't feel the impact. At first he didn't dare drink. He cupped his hands and let a single drop touch his lips. His throat tightened around it, savoring the microscopic relief. He waited. Another drop, then another. Tears welled in his eyes, thick, salty, burning. Slowly, cautiously, he drank more. The water felt like resurrection, like the desert had turned its head away for one merciful second. He stayed there for hours, sipping, resting, fighting the urge to gulp desperately. When his strength began to return, even slightly, he continued walking. The landscape changed, subtle at first, then more noticeably. The dunes gave way to patches of rock, dry shrubs, hints of life the Sahara rarely showed. And then voices. At first he thought it was the wind, then hallucination, then memory, but the voices grew clearer, human, close. He turned his head and saw them, figures wrapped in traditional robes, standing at a distance, watching him with wide eyes. Bedouins, a small group of Saharan nomads. Their expressions flickered between fear and confusion. Mauro must have looked like a ghost, sunburned, skeletal, covered in sand, eyes wild from dehydration. He lifted his hands slowly, trying not to frighten them. They hesitated, whispered among themselves. One took a cautious step forward. Mauro tried to speak, but only a hoarse rasp came out. The Bedouins kept their distance at first, unsure if he was dangerous, dying, or not even real. But curiosity outweighed fear. Eventually, two of them approached and grabbed his arms gently but firmly. The moment they touched him, Mauro nearly collapsed. They carried him across the sand toward their small camp of tents and camels. The world blurred again, colors melted, shapes twisted. He felt himself fading, but forced his eyes open long enough to register the first sip of tea they pushed to his lips. Sweet, hot, jarring. He coughed, choked, but drank. Then another sip. And another. The men spoke to him in Arabic. He didn't understand a word, but their tone was calm, almost protective. They fed him small portions of food, gave him shade, wrapped him in cloth, and let him sleep. When he woke, he heard something that made his breath tremble. Police, gendarmerie, border. The Bedouins gestured toward the horizon, explaining as best they could that they were taking him to authorities to safety, but there was something else in their tone. Something almost amused. Mauro didn't understand until hours later, when he was handed over to Moroccan officers who studied his documents, his appearance, his route, and then exchanged looks of disbelief. He had run so far off course, so deep into the storm, so hopelessly into the unknown, that he wasn't in Morocco anymore. He had crossed the border on foot, disoriented, half dead, guided only by instinct and desperation. He had survived the Sahara long enough to walk into Algeria. The officers looked at him, stunned. The man who had started a race in Morocco had been devoured by the desert and spit out in another country entirely. And against all logic, against all probability, against everything the desert had thrown at him, Mauro Prosperi was still alive.